Paper Award by Institution of Electronics and Telecommunication Engineers. Recently, he was honored with Homi Bhabha Award in Science Education HBASE 2020 and has been selected as AICTE INAE Distinguished Visiting Professor at Symbiosis Institute of Technology, Pune. Dr. Satyanarayana is a fellow of Institution of Electronics and Telecommunication Engineers as well as Institute of Engineers. He is a member of Governing Council of Instrument Society of India as well as a member of Indian Physics Association. He guided a large number of doctoral, master, and undergraduate students. He served on many of the doctoral and expert committees as well as academic council boards of studies and advisory board on colleges, university, and many national organizations of eminence. He is on the editorial or reference terms of refer engineering journals. Dr. Satyanarayan is a senior member of IEEE. He is currently an executive committee member and the chair of the IEEE Bombay section. He has previously served as the vice chair, secretary, chair of the technical and professional activities committee of the section as well as the chair of its signal processing society. He is also served an executive member as well as vice chair of IEEE India Council. He won IEEE Section's Outstanding Volunteer Award for 2014 and IEEE Headquarters MGA Achievements Award for 2016. Now, I would like to welcome our eminent speaker, Dr. B. Satyanarayana, for his talk and take over this session. Sir, please.
Thank you very much, Dr. Viren Patel. It's always a great pleasure to come back to Gujarat. I mean, of course, it's virtual, but as Chirag mentioned, my first visit to Gujarat happened to be with the SPS Congress that the Gujarat section had organized. In fact, not just organized, they actually set an example and set a bar and set a standard on how to kind of do such events. Of course, Gujarat chapter is undoubtedly one of the most active SPSs probably in the region. I don't know, maybe in the world as well. And some of the the recognitions that Chirag mentioned are really an indicator of that. And honestly, I mean, it is a great example for rest of the, not necessarily just only the signal processing societies, but I think in any IEEE bodies, I think it is a great example. You can really see that even a chapter or a society under a section has so much vibrancy and so much of activities under their belt. It really tells what it takes to be, if a person at the top, at the helm of the affairs, is someone who actually takes things so passionately, and the whole thing actually follows. So I really want to take this opportunity to congratulate the Gujarat chapter of SPS, and particularly I would say that a lot of this credit actually goes to Chirag. And so good morning once again formally to Chirag.
Thank you.
And Arpan, and also all the Gujarat section SPS chapter colleagues. And I would like to also to kind of say hi to my colleagues from Bombay section, Ram, who is the TPSC chair, and Dr. Mohan Padnis. I think I saw him on the thing. He's the signal processing chair of Bombay section, and also Yeshudas, who is the vice chair of TPSC and one of the also very active members. So and also all our, of course, Bombay section SPS chapter colleagues and participants, especially the students. I was I'm inspired by Chirag to share that we are also trying to kind of maybe emulate in some sense the best of such organizations within the country, and trying to make the section as well as all the chapters as active as we could get even during this period. And so let's see. And I think there are also a nice opportunity for like what we have today for both section level as well as chapters and society level for synergy. And as I said, SPS Congress was one that they've set example. Of course, we did the next one last year. Unfortunately, it had to be under virtual platform, but I think we really enjoyed, and it was a very, very nice event. I hope we will continue that tradition. Okay. And coming to today, sorry for that long intro, but before I go on to my slides, but I really feel honored, extremely honored, I should say, by being part of this tech talk series. And after Chirag showed the list of very distinguished researchers in the field, and I feel humbled and honored to be part in the same league. I mean, I just happen to talk in the series, not necessarily I'm in the same league. But so why I say partly is due to, I must confess at the very beginning, so that you don't ask me difficult questions at the end. I'm not a SPS researcher per se, right? I mean, you can say that we are more of end users, maybe application beneficiaries of the great field of SPS. But having said that, I want to claim that being in this area where we use signal processing techniques, sensors, and data accumulation systems, and so on, we probably use signal processing at a level where maybe the best in the field, or probably sometimes even better than the best in the field. This is not because of that we are great or others are not great, but the point is we have no other option but to kind of invent the newer techniques, because some of the challenges that we have in running the so-called basic science experiments are a little bit more tougher to handle than some of the, I would say, industrial applications. So that is the long introduction. So let me in fact share my slides. And of course, I know I have just 1 hour to share my excitement, but I have lots of slides. So I'll try to run through in some way, but I'll be very happy to kind of for any discussion that we would like to have at the end, right? Okay. So that is the title, and I'd like to kind of touch upon a little bit about the VLSI-based signal processing in more particular. But as I said, so it's more on applications that I can think, but I'll try to include some examples and applications which are of general interest to all of us. Everyone must remember this is like the first slide, a very auspicious slide of any signal processing. Of course, when you talk about signal processing or sensors, something which comes common to all of our minds is IoT. I don't want to teach you IoT, and I'm sure every one of you are more experts than me. But I just want to kind of focus on a circle, if you can call, from starting from the very simple device to all the way what value it brings to the society. Being IEEE, we always say advancing technology to the humanity. In that spirit, we have, of course, various items that forms the value of IoT, starting from the actual devices. You can call them sensors, and some later I will try to call them these even detectors in the context of science applications. But the main thing is looking at collecting data very efficiently and sensing the data rather very efficiently, and collecting and kind of transporting it using a proper communication methods. This itself is actually can be the upper half, can be more like a data acquisition, which includes signal to sensor to kind of sending the data out. The other part is more to do with what you will do with the data. You will, of course, use all those modern techniques of artificial intelligence and machine learning and so on to analyze this data and get the value, what is, the data value defined by what you would like to do with the action. And as I said, the ultimate beneficiaries are always human. So in the circle that you see on the screen, the upper half is what probably constitutes the today's talk. But I'll try to confine to only a few examples. When you talk about sensor, of course, we all know as a textbook definition, we would like to kind of sense a particular or a detect is something which I'll also use quite commonly. And some of those environments, what characteristics that we have. So we would like to kind of detect sometimes some events and sometimes some changes, sometimes some quantities or whatever. And of course, we'd like to get a corresponding output. But we are all electrical engineers today, probably on the call. So we always like the signal to be electrical because it's more easy to kind of manipulate and manage it. And we go ahead and then build, just a classical circuit if you like it. By the way, this sensor is a Hall probe sensor, which is extensively used in MRI machines and also many of our own science experiments. And then once you are able to pick up the signal from the sensor, the next job, of course, is to kind of condition it or process it and so on and so forth. Sometimes very simple process. Sometimes it involves huge complex operations. That is where VLSI comes to our rescue. It could be a simple amplification, could be computation, could be whatever you would like to do. And as I said, communicate, move data from one place to another place, etc. The logical conclusion, in some sense, as you saw in the previous slide, is something about an actuator, which we are not going to talk too much today. But obviously, you sense and you process because you would like to kind of take certain action based on the environment, conditions and characteristics and so on. Okay, of course, the actuators themselves are progressing extremely fast. And what is also important is quite often, I will have one slide probably to show. Quite often you'll find the sensor, the electronic circuits and actuators end up getting made using the same, let us say, silicon material or semiconductor material. So it actually, the technology integration has really spread end to end. Okay. And I am not going to, as I said, going to say anything about sensors except to kind of tell you today, they are there literally everywhere and they have become so much part of our life. We don't even notice what are all sensors are actually enabling us today. Right now, I'm talking to you. Obviously, there are dozens of sensors at work taking my maybe what I'm speaking all the way to you. Okay, whether there are very mundane sensors that you have, vibration and force and torque, which is actually so much on the industry and aviation, humidity, piezo fluid property, which have become actually major part in transportation, the the movement sensors, the position sensors. I don't want to even overemphasize the fact that today the photo optics have become major, barriers in some way to the pandemic situations, and similarly, the pressure sensors are making headway into industrial as well as the medicine and agriculture and so many parts of it. It's there everywhere. I don't want to overemphasize that fact. So when you want to measure certain physical parameters, as I said in the earlier case, using sensors in some way, at the end, always, ultimately, what are you going to do? You are actually coming down to say that I want to handle very small electrical signals, right? That is what sensors are going to give you. I would, in fact, go ahead and say, instead of saying electrical, I would say charge, because basic electrical signal is actually charge, which any sensor is going to kind of produce. Now, dealing with those small signals, very small signals, is always the main challenge, and that's where the signal processing is so important to build reliable, instruments, design of reliable instruments or systems. Reliability cannot be understated. We'll probably define it a little more formally in the next slide. Now, therefore, the electronic processing, because we are all electrical engineers in some sense, so it is the electronic processing of signals. Why do you do? Of course, you always want to extract certain useful information from them. When I say there is sensor, I'm actually measuring one of those physical parameters. I would like to extract that information ultimately, and I want to measure one quantity very, very accurately, very reliably, and so on and so forth. So ultimately, all these sensors, transports, signal processing, etc., these are all done. Ultimate, my goal is to extract a physical parameter, right? A physical. So I'm not so much interested to measure a voltage or charge or current, but I would like to know, can I measure, let us say, the torque of a motor to the third decimal or 10th decimal? That's what matters. So all that embeds inside is the job that we are paid for as electrical engineers, right? I said sometime back that two of the most crucial, in some sense, parameters or hallmarks, if I can say, is of any signal processing system, or namely accuracy and precision. And there are more hallmarks, as I said, for strategic application, space application, medical instrumentation,
even for some of our science instrumentation, because every little difference there actually makes a huge difference in the outcome. Remember, I mean, when you acquire data from the sensor, when you or process certain data, I mean, if you don't do it, the signal is actually lost forever. You can't really make a wonderful software to kind of recover the lost accuracy or precision. Remember, you can improve, you can refine a little bit to some level, but remember, the signal that is lost, fidelity of a signal that is lost during acquisition or signal processing is lost forever. Now, if I have a quantity that I want to measure, for example, I want to shoot at the center of this particular, let us say, the figure, right? If that is my reference value is the center, now my question comes is how accurately I'm able to, if I were given 4 bullets, how accurately I'm going to kind of shoot them at. Okay, it looks like I have done reasonably well in the sense of I was close to the reference value. So maybe the distance between the actual value, what I want to obtain, and then what I finally ended up doing it is actually accuracy. So it's like you can call that as a value that is differing from the reference value, ideal value, whatever it is, right? But if you look at the right side figure, of course, that I have, this is still my goal, but it so happened that I was able to kind of shoot all 4 bullets pretty close to each other, but unfortunately they are quite far from the designed value, right? So I must say that this is quite accurate because I'm pretty close in the inner circle of the point where I want to shoot, but unfortunately they're not very precise because every bullet strayed to different places. But here they're very nice. They're all together in some way very, very precise, but unfortunately far away from the accuracy. I would like to have this value close to the reference value. I also would like to have the so-called the Bell distribution or Gaussian distribution, as you call, with many samples. The width of the distribution I would like to have as narrow as possible, as small as possible. Of course, ideally, I will tell you, I would like to have a delta function here, right, with the highest level of precision. So remember, accuracy and precision are those hallmarks for any signal processing engineers to keep in mind. You can't really build systems which are lousy and which will give more problems than it can solve, right? When you put yourself in such a tight picture, one must remember on what these main factors that what I have to deliver depend on. So of course, it depends on, for example, the sensor signal. What is the duration of the signal? Is it a very tiny, spiky kind of thing, or is it something which is reasonably broad so that I can probably have an access to the signal much longer time? Maybe I will be able to kind of build a more reliable system. But remember, this is not in your hand. It depends on the sensors that you use. It depends on, for example, some of us, what we build signal processing systems. It depends on, let us say, a particular science event, which, basically a certain particle intercepting a detector volume, producing probably a signal which is only a nanosecond wide or a 2 nanosecond wide. So you can't ask, I would like a signal which is 1 second long. So it's very important. Remember, the signals are very high, bandwidth. I require the electronics to be much higher bandwidth, right? I can't have sloppy 10 megahertz, let us say op-amps and build systems that can have a very, very high speed, 1 gigahertz, 1 giga sample, 1 giga, let us say hertz signals or 1 nanosecond rise times and so on. So it's very important. The linearity makes a big thing. If my sensor is very linear to a physical quantity, I'm quite happy because it is easy to kind of deal with. But don't expect all the sensors to be very linear. Some of them are non-linear by design. Okay, some of them might have certain offsets. Some of them might have a possible saturation. You can't expect I can measure from minus 100 degrees to plus 100 degrees Celsius using a single sensor. Am I able to reproduce the signal? Let us say, irrespective of the time, irrespective of the temperature, irrespective of ambient conditions, etc., etc. Remember, in some of the sensors, the mobility of charges depend as a function of temperature, right? So therefore, it also becomes important how I'm able to actually maintain this entire system, or in case I can't maintain, how do I take care of it, those changes in the reproducibility of signals. Like humans, electronics do age with time, and they change their response with time because of many reasons, sometimes natural degradation, that happens depending on what sensor you're using. As I said, sometimes operating conditions, sometimes ambient parameters, and so on. Aging is very, very important factor to consider. So how are you going to build a reliable system as we agreed upon in the previous slide, irrespective of these big problems that we face? I think the only issue that you can kind of do is you always be, should be always checking, not checking, but more technical word for that is calibrating the measurements. So you must be continuously calibrating. Sometimes we call them as in situ calibration. That means as the system is working, you must have mechanism to be able to take care of the aging, to be able to take care of linearity, to be able to take care of reproducibility, and so on and so forth. And if you can really do, well, then your accuracy and precision can be kind of maintained as best as one can. This often is the most toughest thing to do in any signal processing system. Please remember that. Now, when you have signals coming as we agreed, because in the sensors, the signals are not going to be very large. One of the reasons, I mean, there are many reasons. One of the reasons is sensors often are those little devices which are going to sit in the field, and it's very difficult to kind of bias them using at a very high voltages or high currents and so on and so forth. Remember, some of the sensors, work on, let us say, solar power. They harvest power from solar. Suppose I threw billions and millions of sensors on the field. Here, they measure, let us say, parameters from an agriculture field, or maybe sensors which deal with seismology or any other natural disasters, etc. I'm not going to go and connect each one of them by wires, right? They're going to stay on their own autonomously, and they are supposed to organize themselves into wireless sensors. So those cases, it becomes very tough to expect very large current, right, or large voltage. So invariably, the first thing that you would like to do is some amplifier, whatever, inescapable. You can't really many times escape basic amplifiers, right? You need most of the sensor system. Some occasions, you will find that you actually have good enough signal from a sensor, but unfortunately, you might want to kind of drive for long distances. So matching of the impedance between the driver and the signal conditioning circuit also becomes important, because you don't want to have, let us say, a impedance mismatch and then have all those reflections and get into all those troubles. So therefore, the amplifier need not be classical definition of an amplifier, but sometimes we also call them as buffers, which actually convert the, let us say, the impedance, output impedance of a sensor such a way that it will actually allow you to kind of drive long distances, right? As I said, in some cases, they are very small, so you want to amplify them. Sometimes it depends, because as I said, the source cannot give larger signal. And this we already mentioned. But the point that I was kind of trying to say is data, if it has to be transferred over long distances without error, without EMI, without EMC, etc., it becomes very important to have some kind of amplified stage in the beginning. Of course, we are all human beings. We all like to handle large signals and be very comfortable with this. Okay, now when you talk about amplifiers, this is not a classroom, so I shouldn't be going into a tutorial mode, but I really want to kind of give certain flavors of amplifiers that we all work with, right? We sometimes say current sensitive amplifier. You have a sensor which gives you a current, and of course, I mean, I would like to amplify and maybe convert into a voltage which is very comfortable to us to put an ADC and so on. It looks simple. You will say, yeah, you take current and put a resistor and you get voltage, isn't it? But here I kind of try to show an op amp and so on and so forth, right? Why is that? It's important because I'm actually playing, or I'm gaining by the so-called open loop gain of the op amp, and you can actually see the actual input impedance is not just the RF that I have put. RF is actually a gain element for me, because that is what you saw here. My output voltage is actually a gain that is decided by RF. The larger the RF, the better, isn't it? But then how do I get the signal in? How do I get the current into my circuit? So if I connect them across in an open loop on a feedback, you see my RF gets divided by the open loop gain of the amplifier. That means I'm actually making RF to be very, very small without compromising on the RF. Okay, this is a simple question. Why for all the circuits why use op amp? I mean, op amp is a great what you call philanthropist in some way. It actually offers fantastic the so-called characteristics which help in building a very good, nice instrumentation system. I don't want to go beyond that, but what we study, what we do in the colleges, and we set up always the so-called inverting, non-inverting amplifiers, etc. What is wrong? They're perfectly fine. I give a voltage here and I get perfect gain, which is only decided by the two passive components. Everything looks quite nice until you leave the college, right? When you leave the college and come and happen to join me, you will find on the first day, you will find this operational amplifier based or voltage sensitive amplifier is something which is the most troublesome circuit that can work with science applications. Why? It is so nice. We have seen 4 years in the college. The problem is, if you look at, I want to connect a sensor here, and this is my amplifier, voltage amplifier. The output, what I can see is in some way is what is the charge that I'm pumping in from or pumping out from my detector divided by what is the total capacitance that I'm going to have. The cable, the input side, and the sensor, and so on, the total capacitance. Now imagine I make 1,000 detectors or 1,000 sensor, and each sensor has a slight difference in the overall total capacitance. For the same charge that I'm producing in the detector, I'm actually going to get a different V in. Even my the resistors are really nice. The circuit is very nice. I end up getting output which is varying based on sensor to sensor, and that is the most catastrophic thing that can happen to build a reliable system. So often what you think is very simple circuits, one must remember they're not so simple because they can give you trouble. So therefore, we don't use voltage sensitive amplifiers often in the technology in the science applications, but we go ahead and do what is called charge sensitive. I mentioned to you everything, all the signals that are produced in sensors or detectors are essentially charged. I actually takes this charge and put across a capacitor the way you do for an integrator circuit, a low pass filter circuit, if you want to consider. What I'm doing here is exactly like your current sensitive amplifier, except the resistor replaced by a capacitor. Again, the same great nice qualities of an op-amp come into picture, right? Here, even if I have different detectors, of course, any sensor can be approximated by a current device, let us say, signal source, the capacitance which I showed of the total capacitance, and this is my op-amp circuit here, which actually comes with not just CF. CF actually gets multiplied here. There you remember it is divided by the RF by A. It is CF into A. That means all this total capacitance that I'm talking about, which are part of here, which made havoc in case of voltage sensitive amplifier, I found that detector capacitance is much smaller compared to this huge bank of capacitance, which is CF into A. And you can actually see the total capacitances happen to be CF into A, which means a huge capacitance. Now, what is that going to help me? Just take one simple example. If you take even a moderate open loop gain of about 1,000, and if I have even a CF of just 1 PF, by the way, CF is my gain, right? You should remember. So see, V out by Q is my gain, and that is minus 1 by CF. So CF is the gain element here. Remember, unlike voltage sensitive amplifiers, where we say gain is a direct, dimensionless quantity, they are not dimensionless. It depends on whether you use current or charge or voltage. Even if you take the detector capacitance is changing 10 times here, it will only change by just 10%. So that is the beauty of charge sensitive amplifiers configuration. And that is why it is much more elegant in terms of signal processing applications. Of course, many of people who work in industry, they also use differential or instrumentation amplifier. That is a wonderful thing to do, because when you use in a very hostile conditions where the signals might be crossing high power lines and there are lots of EMI, EMC, it is always best to use differential signal rather than using single-ended, because single-ended are prone to the hiccups. Now, if I have the differential stage at the input, of course, the common mode is what is getting handled well, right? Now, if I can have one stage at the input, which is going to make sure that there's no gain for the common mode and there is only a gain for the signal, which is actually called a differential the gain. That is just again like your standard amplifier decided by the passive feedback components. Here you have R2 here and you have R1 between the two stages. So 2R2 plus R1 by R1, right? That is your the first stage or input stage. And then you take this differential gain, which you already had, you change the impedance nicely, and you can connect to a low impedance stage in the second stage, which is a very standard differential, you can say inverting, non-inverting, whatever you like. And that is again decided by the feedback components of R4 by R3. So by just doing it, you are only making sure only the differential component gets through and reject all that. Of course, it depends on what level you will be able to reject the common mode. But in principle, the instrumentation amplifiers are the ones that you need to be putting. Of course, they, in terms of the bandwidth, in terms of signal fidelity, they may or may not be as great as what I've shown here. But for industrial applications, you are not looking at very, very large gain bandwidth. Okay. As I said, we all like somehow digital world, and we always feel very uncomfortable when we have to deal with small signals and analog side. So the first opportunity, we take an analog signal, put across a comparator or threshold, and say, okay, I'll put a reference voltage and my input voltage is more than or less than or whatever it is. And then I say that I would like to have a logic 1 or a 0 signal. This is something like analog to digital conversion, but at 1 bit, right? Analog to digital converter can be 10 bit, 8 bit, 14 bit, 16 bit. But if I am talking about ADC with just 1 bit resolution, either 0 or 1, that is what a comparator is. It looks very simple. It is an open loop, no feedback circuit, and it gives you whatever you like. But I'm not going to kind of details in it. But if you really want to build a realistic comparators, discriminators, a feedback from output input is required. Some of you, I'm not sure, but this is what is called, let us say, hysteresis. That ensures that the threshold that you maintain when in one state, the threshold that you maintain in the other state of the comparator are not the same. That will allow you to maintain a certain small band of threshold, which you can adjust based on what is the noise that is overriding on that signal. This is very important. This is the hysteresis, something what you actually come across in the magnetic, electromagnetics, but this is used to advantage in this particular field. Okay, I'm not going to talk much about the ADCs per se here, just because they're very classical kind of thing, the successive approximation, which you already know quite well, and most of them, just because this is rather slow, even though it is very nice and simple method to kind of, successively approximating the input signal, people go ahead and use the so-called sigma delta, which is more industrially preferred one, because you actually want some cases very low frequency signal. They're not as good as I was showing, but you want very high resolution, maybe 20 bit, maybe 24 bits, which becomes very expensive if you really want to have other designs. And you all, particularly audio, where the low distortion becomes a very, very important. And you would like to remember, I talked to you, both linearity and accuracy are the main factor. Here again, the front end is something very similar, but what you actually will be doing is you actually look at 1 bit at a time, moving from the input signal. And I would like to, for example, if I give, let us say, no signal at all, I would like to kind of have a bank of bits which are 20 bits, let us say all 00. Obviously, when I have the Vin which is equal to Vmax, I would like to have a code which is 111. Now, can I really toggle between these two depending on 1 bit at a time? So therefore, the higher the input voltage, can I get more ones as a thermal codes than at the lower voltages? But the operation is again decided by one comparator, and let us say the stage that is followed by an integrator circuit here, and the comparator, which will be again flipping between 1 bit to 1 bit ADC, as we talked about, and ultimately the feedback, which decide whether a VRIF should be 0 or 1, and you keep toggling this for 1 sigma at a time. But the point ultimately is, if you are able to kind of build systems like this with using one comparator, and we know the problem is because every step is kind of sequenced and it takes time. Can I actually forget about all that and build n number of those comparators and string them together, and then take their thresholds, instead of giving from a DAC or a feedback, can I actually build a resistor network and let us say binary coded resistor network starting from 201, 2 power 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. And then I feed the input parallel to n bank of comparators. And of course, I'll get the code together maybe in one flash, right? And then all I require is basically to have some kind of encoder to convert the thermal code of these signals and generate a more amenable digital code, what you want to use, right? So the advantage is very like a flash, like a parallel. That's why it's called parallel or flash ADC. Of course, the flip side is I would need many comparators instead of one comparator that it. But as advances that happens in VLSI, it becomes much easier to build many comparators. That's why this has become a major element now inside all those digitizers because this is something that gives you the fantastic speeds which are not possible by any of those techniques that I talked about. Some of us use a kind of slightly different ADC where the precision required is of highest level. If this is my signal that I would like to convert on, I don't just take like a peak sensing or successive approximation ADC, look at only the peak. We don't. We actually integrate the entire signal on this signal. How do you do that? You actually build a circuit like this. You take the signal through a linear gate and allow this guy to charge a capacitor, right? You open the switch in such a way that signal actually charges this capacitor. After the signal is charged fully, like what is shown here, you actually close this and allow this charge to go through a constant discharge source. But please time when you are actually discharging this, because this is a constant current discharge, and you time it by flipping and counting the number of clock ticks that happen. So what is the total time it took to discharge the charge which is actually charged by this signal? The longer the number of clock cycles, the longer that it takes time. That means the longer the charge that is accumulated, that means the longer the charge under the area of the curve. This is as simple as that, but this is the most accurate systems that you can build by using the so-called Wilkinson ADC. This is most commonly what we use. Now, as I said, all this nowadays become on a fast track just because of microelectronics, right? So there, of course, manufacturing techniques or design techniques handling very small electronic circuits, right? Most of these are typically made from semiconductor material, but most important thing, remember, we don't use anymore these wires and the cables that we connect, but they're all actually bonded inside using wire bonding techniques in the microelectronics technique. Of course, as technologies improved, the scale of the microelectron component has continued to reduce. But the problem, we enjoy this, of course, because the chips become smaller. But the issue is that as the scales become smaller and smaller, the problems we never faced before, we considered resistor as a pure resistor, capacitor as a pure capacitor, and so on. But now it is no more true. If I have a resistor at a very tiny scale and operating it at a very high frequencies, I should consider the resistor to be reactive. I should consider this to be, let us say, a resistor with a capacitor across it, maybe a series impedance, a series inductor to a resistor. So now the new components come in at higher frequency. The effects of that, the so-called intrinsic circuit properties, becomes intolerable. So you really need to worry about it. So it's not all that great when you go smaller and smaller size. But the goal of this really microelectronics is to really engineer and take care that you will be able to compensate for this undesired effects, because at the end you are actually going to benefit by making smaller, faster, low power, and cheaper devices, right? So that is the whole game. Now, when you talk about in particular digital circuits, you only talk most of the cases point-to-point connections or a combinatorial circuits where I give n number of inputs and I want to run a Boolean algebra on this and get an output. Or maybe some of you will also be interested to kind of make what is called a clock-based sequential device where I provide a clock and data moves from one place to another place, not instantaneously like a combinatorial circuits like an AND gate or whatever, but actually this is going to be like a flip-flop, a memory cell and so on. And invariably, no matter what digital circuits you talk about, these are the three elements that all the digital electronics will be made of, right? And we have all started this journey when we are in school and colleges, went ahead and bought these simple, nice tables, whose truth tables are well written, and we know what are inputs, what are outputs, and how the inputs get connected. And these are the kind of ICs, all the manufacturers, multiple manufacturers produce them. You go to a small town electronic shop, you'll be able to buy them. You come and connect them and they work well, right? There is nothing wrong. This is absolutely quite nice. But when you become, come into an industry, when you come into a science lab, it's not always, these circuits are good enough. You will actually say, no, I have very specific requirements for application like what we do every day. So therefore, I need to kind of design for this particular use a special IC. Okay, this is not something one of those 74 series that I can buy from the market. What is main difference is, unlike the manufacturer decides the specifications and truth tables of those ICs, here the applications actual user designs this chip. Of course, you can't fabricate in your lab or college or whatever industry. You will actually send it to a foundry, get the IC made. That's why these are, of course, called application-specific integrated circuit. Something between these two, there could be a different species of circuits which are application-specific, fine, but they're also a little bit like a standard product. If you and me are the guys who are actually making wireless switches, or maybe making the CPUs, or making, let us say, some encoding devices, these are, let us say, product manufacturer of a particular type. And it's likely that both of us need the same kind of ASICs in some sense, but those are not so common that it becomes an industrial standard ICs. So this is something in between, application specific, but actually not made by you and me, but they're actually made by industry. But it's more like a standard product. So this is also a species of ICs. These are how these are kind of divided into these three categories. When you talk about the general IC, which I showed you some time back, of course, it's very nice, right? We all work on putting them on the printed circuit boards or breadboards and so on. When I joined TIFR in 1983, I actually played with such kind of lots of circuits. And you can see all these are in black and white. So that is the era of black and white photography. So you will find that I used tons of integrated circuits, building all of those, half a meter by half a meter boards and connect them in, whatever way it is. But the final thing is they do work. I mean, there is no problem about using them. But what is the problem? The problem is about programmability. It's often quite time consuming and sometimes very risky. For example, if I made a mistake in designing, some small mistake in this IC, there is no way I really need to kind of redesign the whole circuit, make a new printed circuit board or whatever it is. Okay, and it is quite tough to kind of build complex systems. I can't build very complex system just using those ICs, right? And very little scope for correction. Programmable logic actually solves these problems, and of course, it also offers many benefits. Now, if somebody gives me like a white canvas equivalent to an IC, I can explore and I can actually build a much novel architectures in my field, in my lab, with those programmable chips. Instead of somebody deciding the truth table in the factory, if the person gives me, say that this is the chip, I'm just giving you a blank one, you decide whatever way to program. So I can actually enhance the functionality and performance of this system. For example, just one example I want to give you. Suppose I go and buy a microcontroller which runs at 4 megahertz, 6 megahertz, I don't know, in the market. And instead of that, and I live with that, and I actually develop a system with that. But if somebody gives me a programmable chip which can run at 50 megahertz, for example, which is quite common these days, hundreds of megahertz is common. And also, the chips come with it's a big, I can say real estate on the chip. Why one microcontroller? I can actually put 10 microcontrollers, not running at 4 megahertz or 10 megahertz. I can actually run them at maybe 50 megahertz. I can do a lot of parallel operation by incorporating such designs. I can even simplify problems which are very difficult to solve, let us say, by standard logic circuits, by programmability. So the order reduction or parallel operation are just two of the examples I'm saying. Of course, FPGA is a major element today in the programmable devices, where you will be able to program a big array of gates in the field. That's why the FPGA, right? And it will enable you to program all the product features and functions And what? I mean, I can even make a product using an FPGA, maybe install in your home. And if you allow me to kind of access to that, I can configure your product. Hence, I mean, by configuring the programmable device, maybe add a new standard, new functionality, and so on and so forth, right? So this is something which we all enjoy these days. And this class of devices which are allowed to do this is what we call programmable devices, and FPGAs have grown up from a more mundane programmable devices, complex devices, and today we have very, very high, performance FPGAs, which have become a norm in the signal processing circuits, really bringing lots of advantages in terms of size, power, cost, and time to market, and so on and so forth. These devices are, I mean, in general, like consist of thousands of logic blocks into which you can insert any of the programmable Boolean functions that you want to do. And then it allows you to also programmable, lines, connections from the logic block to other logic block and so on. These are also programmable, and ultimately you want to bring certain outputs or inputs to the pins around the IC, so you can even program them. So I can program what I like in terms of Boolean algebra. I can actually connect from one block to another block the way I like, the way we do in a breadboard, and I can also kind of program the way I want to connect them on the pins, either as input or outputs. So everything is kind of allowed. That's why the programmable chip. Just to give you one very quick example, suppose I would like to kind of program a logic function called y equal to a and b or c. Right? There are three variables and one output. I can actually draw this. I can immediately draw a truth table. I can go inside an FPGA if it happened to have lookup tables, those elements that I showed you. You put this logic truth table inside. I have the inputs of ABC, and then based on the status of ABC, I'm going to get Y. Perfectly fine, very simple, very, very nice. And tomorrow someone comes and says, no, I don't like Y equal to A and B or C. I actually like Y equal to A or C, A or B and C. Doesn't matter. It takes just 2 seconds. I will actually produce a new truth table and put it here. The circuit works as you like. I mean, as simple as that, right? So as I said, since not just the lookup tables here, but even the elements that are connecting to each other can also be programmed, that will bring a new fabric gate array into the interconnects there, right? How fine I would like to main these logic blocks, how small the logic block should be, how big they are. I mean, that's all that's all up to you, because there are usually several millions of logic blocks in one chip. And as I said, those interconnections are also possible. There are varieties of interconnections that are possible. One of them is so-called anti-fuse, where it's like if I want to connect or disconnect two wires, just like a fuse in our electrical circuit in our home, either I make or break. I can also use standard, cells, standard cells, CMOS cells, where I can actually decide to operate on the base of such a cell and make sure the source to drain connection and ensure that the input wires get connected to whatever output I want. I can even have standard random access memory, static random access memory chips, which connects one wire of one logic element to one wire of the other logic element. All that requires is in that interconnection, I have to write either a 0 or 1, like the way you write in a memory cell, that gets connected or disconnected. Each one of these has a special advantage and disadvantage. These are very fast, for example, but unfortunately they're volatile. And maybe, for example, the flash scheme, for example, is not volatile at all, but maybe the power-wise it takes a little more time, and it is slow in speed, and so on and so forth. So it depends. You pick up the chips which you like, depending on what logic and what suits to you. Also, more often, the so-called cores, soft cores or hard cores, which you want to embed inside the FPGA also becomes an important element, right? Some of them actually offer you, like a microcontroller, how you program outside, right? Either it is an Altera or Intel. They offer one kind of processor. If it is Xilinx, another kind of processor. After I buy the chip, after I do all the programmable hardware, I can also program the processor and do similar programming like I do a microcontroller. If you like, you can ask the vendor to say, look, no, You give me the hardcore processors with a built-in ARM Cortex or PowerPC or something like, you can actually run them as well. So depending on that, there are various manufacturers. The most common ones today are here. Almost 90% of the share is actually between Intel and old Altera and Xilinx, but there are also other manufacturers. And you can see, depending on, the kind of interconnectivity, sometimes there is SRAM, sometimes it is flash, and so on and so forth. You pick up based on your application, what is the thing that you like. Something great value to the younger people in the audience is that FPGAs offer development of intellectual property course. It's called IP course. What does it mean? I pick up an FPGA offered by one of the manufacturer. I go ahead and build applications of my liking or what is in the market today, what they like. These IP, intellectual property, that belongs to you. You can actually sell them, or you can donate them, or you can even sell to a product manufacturer and say, look, I have actually developed a protocol controller, and using which you can actually manufacture a product very quickly, reducing the time to market, maybe lowering the cost, reducing the power, maybe very reliable because I already made that IP for you. You want to buy it, and you will be surprised. Even the FPGA manufacturers, they would like to have the IPs there because that will add value to their product of IPs. So this is one of the nice opportunity for young members to get involved as a startup. Now, just to give you a feeling, the Intel FPGA system allows you fantastic tools for development kits for you to run IP cores, evaluation kits to test your system. Of course, the Quartus is the main EDA tool for Intel. And all these are possible, the reference designs that you can have. And Intel will be very happy to kind of source your IPs. Maybe they will even buy your IPs if they find it to be very, very valuable, right? Of course, you have to learn, obviously, the so-called hardware description languages in order to be able to work with, especially FPGA devices. The most common ones these days, the classical ones are so-called VHDL and Verilog. I'm sure all of you must be, those younger members must be learning in your college. But the one that is really now working out much better is so-called HLS, which stands for high-level synthesis. It's much easier to program. And one such system by Vivado, by Xilinx, is actually taking a big ground. So if you are a starter, if you want to really do something, maybe you don't do in VHDL, maybe not in Verilog, but probably HLS is something which you would like to get an expertise on, right? This is a big slide. I don't want to spend more time on it, but I just want to introduce that FinFET is technology which is now, instead of just having a standard gate for source and drain, a simple unidirectional or linear gate. Now people have played with, early 2000s, they played with having a different design for the gate, either one-dimensional or two-dimensional or three-dimensional like Omega, or even four-dimensional, means all four directions. I want to increase the current density passing, the current passing from source to drain. I can actually improve the switching speeds phenomenally. I mean, even way back in 2000s, people got input to output delays of less than a nanosecond. That really shows what is the kind of big technology change that happened in the IC. And that is how all the other chips that happened after that start using the FinFET technologies. And you can imagine starting from 1985, where a few years after I started my career, where you had a chip with have just a 60 odd flip-flops. Today you're talking about system blocks of the order of 3 mega cells. So you remember, these are kilo, and here it is 3,000, 4,000. So you're talking about 3 to 4 mega cells, those elements. That's not something interests me more. What actually interests me more is, if you look at this last line here, there are 30 gigabit kind of serial high-speed links, hundreds of them in one chip. It's not just only number crunching or computation, but I can actually transfer data very fast, and not on one line, but hundreds of lines. And this is what I told you sometime back when I said IoT. Transfer of data in some cases becomes a bottleneck, not just the computation. So these chips have really did that kind of an advantage, where olden days when you had to kind of process data from two streams, if I had to have 4 multiple FPGAs with all interconnections, now you are actually talking about one chip inside, and I can feed the data at 100 gigabits kind of Ethernet lines, and I get all that in a linear fashion. But ultimately having, terabits per second kind of bandwidth, right? And that is a phenomenal kind of speed that one got with the modern chips. And finally came to a level of, not just devices, but the entire system on one single chip that becomes, becomes a useful part where I can have different processing elements. You decide whichever processor you like to work with and program, and you will have all the memory architectures, you can imagine here every single interface that you can think of today can actually be put in one. You actually have multi-processor system on one chip. They're all possible because the feature sizes have really gone down to few nanometers kind of level, and then you can incorporate more and more of the systems and on one chip. And what is also important is that things like the Zinc UltraScale kind of chips, they allow you directly to port operating systems inside. Gone are those days where you write very, very expensive, I mean, writing firmware development takes away lives of people. Now you are saying that, no, we run standard Linux sitting, on your chip. So it's like buying a laptop or buying a computer from company or from market, and you actually run from day one. This is how it changed. It's not just the conventional multiprocessors. And if some of you are, let us say, RF engineers working on microwave or 5G or some applications, similar chips have also come up in parallel in the RF arena. You're actually talking about multiple processor systems, 64, 32-bit, doesn't matter. I have, as I told you, hundreds of transceivers to receive and send data at very, very high speeds. I have not one, not two, dozens of ADCs, dozens of DACs, digital data converters, up converter, down, all the elements that I require to kind of build a standard, let us say, software-enabled radios or antenna applications, microwave applications, all those become possible by just one particular chip. Gone are those days where I require huge number of chips, power consumption, cooling, thermal management, and all that. And that is how today we are talking about. Since I work on science experiments, I want to give a little excitement maybe for a few minutes. Olden days, I remember I'm talking about 1965, when I was 3 years old, when some of my colleagues built an experiment at about 2.5 kilometers below the Earth. That time they discovered what is called, a neutrino, which is a very interesting particle. Forget about that for now. The experiment that they built, the data acquisition system that they built is very interesting. They have some kind of flash tubes, which you can see these dots. And when the tracks actually go and intercept those tubes which are into the screen, they actually glow and give like an LED, like a light. Now you might say, how do I acquire data from here? The way they acquire the data is they take a photograph. That actually there is a camera which is operated automatically, and it actually clicks a picture when the light glows up. And then they print that picture and then connect up the dots. I can call this as a signal processing. I can call this as a data acquisition. But that kind of an experiment, I actually discovered something quite an amazing discovery that was made in 1965. You will wonder, how do you record even the time of this event? Nowadays, you have GPS, which you can record maybe tens of nanoseconds level. They actually put a wall clock on the experiment itself, because when you click with the camera, along with the track and the lights, it will also actually take a picture of this wall clock, which will tell you what time the event is. It's just for fun. I want to show you how such a simple so-called data acquisition systems and signal processing systems can make amazing discovery in science, right? But from there we went. Today we are talking about a massive detector in which I'm working, which will weigh about 50,000 tons. We are planning to study the same neutrinos after something like, almost 55 years or 60 years. But this kind of experiment now uses some of the most, state-of-the-art kind of technology in terms of signal processing. We talk about, there are about 4 million detector channels. All these are sensors. I would like to process their signals using, FPGA-based elements. For example, you can see this blue element has many signal processing individual blocks. The data comes through a network, which is like 2 or 3 tier switching network. And there is also what is called so-called trigger system, which will decide when to record data, when not to record data. But in the process, we end up fabricating a large number of ASICs, application-specific integrated circuits. Some of the students like who are there probably on this call, they join the groups as a graduate students, as a PhD students, and they will say, I want to design the front-end electronics for the detector or sensor. They'll actually study what are all components that are required. You need to transimpedance, you change the input impedance, you need to make differential amplifiers the way I said before, maybe some of the comparators, maybe drivers, maybe multiplexers, buffers, and so on. They actually draw what all components that are required. And then they'll sit down with the most basic things that you learn in a college, and namely say that if I want to build such a kind of circuitry, for example, if I were to push current coming from the device, the current actually flowing through these transistors, and this is my element into which I want to charge the capacitor, the way I shown you in a typical current amplifier. And the best thing about it is I don't have any feedback from output to input, right, in this. So this is very important because this makes it to work much faster, right? And then the output time constant is only decided by the output circuit here, and the input resistance, as you said, is decided only by so-called 1 by GM. You remember, 1 by RM is the input resistance and the reverse of that. So the advantage of this circuit is it will be very high bandwidth because, as I said, there is no feedback from input to output. The same thing, they will go down and say, okay, now I'm going to kind of put all this together. I need something at the input stage where I need to make all the biases. I need to kind of have multiple differential high bandwidth amplifier. I need to drive this signal using low voltage differential signal. I want to incorporate that hysteresis to take care of that little noise and make the entire bias circuit all myself, all in one chip. And then when I can do that, I actually ended up building an application-specific device which I need to send to a kind of manufacturer and get the chips out here, right? Similarly, if I want to measure time difference between two signals, let us say there is one signal here, there is another signal here, the time difference between these two signals, like a stopwatch, if I want to measure them, at what accuracy? Not milliseconds, but I would like to have them at few hundred picoseconds, okay? Now, another student sits down and say, okay, I'll make an ASIC, not a mixed signal ASIC, but I'll make a digital ASIC, which will convert the time difference between these two edges to a level of 125 picoseconds, for example, okay, like this. Very simple. I have this clock which is going, and I will measure how many full clocks I have. Besides that, I have a small, partial clock signals because these start and stop can come at any time. So I have to measure these T1 and T2 very accurately using a vernier, and T3, I want to measure it, let us say, using even a coarse counter. So if I can use T1 plus T3 minus T2 is going to give me the time difference. Very simple principle, classical operation, but you take advantage of the fact that now you have devices where you can put down and build your own ASIC, right? You can also program, as I said, the soft processor that is sitting inside an FPGA, right? For example, then I can build all the interfaces that are required to communicate. It could be a flash controller, it could be a SPI bridge, it could be a communication bridge, it could be a memory bridge, whatever I like, or maybe parameters, temperature, etc. I need to measure, and all those elements which are sitting on the board, I'll be able to kind of interface them to the FPGA by programming the, let us say, the NEOS in this case, because it's Ultra chip. But if you happen to be, other FPGA devices, you might have to take like Microblaze, etc. in case of Xilinx and so on. But this is again offering you a nice flexibility where you can actually program and then operate it as an autonomous system. So when we did that together, the entire complicated big system to handle 128 channels, actually 256 channels in some way, becomes feasible to do it on one single small board. This particular board is just about 10 centimeter long and 10 centimeter two sides of a rectangle or a right angle triangle. You'll be able to handle using, let us say, one FPGA here, and the timing chip here. And the data that is converted, I can put it on RJ45 and Ethernet connections. And I can actually program each of these chips sitting anywhere in the world. So I can assign an IP number to each of these devices. That means the entire experiment I can operate remotely. So that is really the beauty of how systems are. If you don't like copper RJ45, you can actually take out that part and put a fiber link and maybe operate even at a much higher rate, maybe 10 gigabytes per second. You don't like the old processor, go back with Intex and then build the same system. Sometimes we also do what is called switched capacitor array. There is a bank of capacitors here. I would like to give an input signal to this bank. My input signal is something like this, and at every let us say 200 picoseconds, that signal is held across the banks of these capacitors. And after some time, I'll come back and say to each of these capacitors, I'll tell, please give me the signal, and I will actually convert them into using a flash ADC. So I will be able to digitize this input waveform, which is rather fast signal. I can actually digitize very faithfully using what is called a switched capacitor array, SCA. And this becomes a very important ASIC that we develop, because you can also use this, like what I said, like digitizers earlier, along with the flash ADC. And if I define this ASIC, I can go ahead and actually use such an ASIC married to a field programmable gate array. And as I said, you need an ADC to convert. You can build a system which can do a 5 gigasamples per second kind of 8-bit 8-channel chip on a small footprint. That is what allows you to build very high speed digitizers, which has actually now become a main market in the image processing and signal processing systems, right? So we end up, starting from very classical kind of thing, we end up making a large number of ASICs, generations of, I would say, signal processing electronics as a requirement for the circuits used by science applications. We end up making thousands and thousands of such boards, and that is how it looks like. I want to take you to even little different scale. If you go to experiments where abroad, in which some of us participate, you will find those detectors are also very massive. You can see a person standing here, how big these detectors are. One such experiment in which I work is what discovered so-called Higgs boson, the God particle, as you call. Now, the challenge is much more. Now you are talking about around 20 million electronics channels from one detector, and every 25 nanoseconds, you need to kind of acquire data from 20 million detector channels and send the data on the backend. How do you do it? It's a completely complex scenario. You can really imagine that the kind of architecture that will happen for a signal processing circuits is extremely complicated. Starting from really detector end, I need to kind of top down. I need to kind of approach the problem in a top down, bringing multiple banks of DAQ links and DAQ systems in the front end, and ultimately getting the readout builder networks and coming all the way to the farm. Remember, this kind of design of the circuits takes a lot of time. As I told you, starting from 25 nanoseconds clock, that is all that the time you have, and to acquire data which will take literally gigabits per second service lines and petabytes of data streaming in, and the entire system to build, maybe it takes 25 years. You should be able to visualize what kind of devices are going to become available 25 years from now, what kind of computers are becoming available now, maybe 30 years from now, and building devices accordingly becomes an important thing. One example which I was kind of trying to show, the Zinc ultrascale processor, which I talked to you sometime about, is actually used, and you can see how compact you could actually make. Unfortunately, the chip itself is not seen because it is hidden behind this particular heat sink, but these are all the high-speed links that I was talking about, pushing the data at 30-40 gigabits per second. You can actually use very high-end FPGAs, deep GPUs, and so-called TPUs, tensor processing units. That is what builds the experiments today. That is why I said some of the applications that we invent and discover in some way is the path breaker for many applications that will happen elsewhere in the industry, right? Sometimes the applications could be as far-fetched like medical or agriculture applications, right? And sometimes here it is when you talk about getting the signals processed from, let us say, a big network of sensors which are planted on hundreds of acres of land, looking at each of the plants in a micro level and the whole field in a macro level, holistic level, and also looking at the soil parameters, the nutrition, the water level, etc. I mean, this becomes a big problem, and the sensors are supposed to be doing it in a way nowadays. It was very interesting. I was looking at, people are going to a level of building the entire sensors and the entire electronics on about 100 milligrams kind of a scale. Okay, why it is so small? Why are they going into so small level? I don't want to run them on a drone or on other systems. I want to mount these electronics on the back of, let us say, bumblebees. And as the bees fly over the field, I would like to kind of get data from such kind of sensors. And can I really use for an IoT platform? This is very, very interesting. But the challenge that you have is, okay, the bees go all around, and you need to kind of have the stations from where the data need to be collected. Position also need to be collected and so on. And how do you do it with low power and sitting on the back of bumblebee? It becomes very difficult. So people use what is called, backscatter kind of transmission. I actually transmit a signal maybe from my transmitter here. The data from those little sensors that you have actually put back as a modulated signal. It's a low frequency. It's a very small data. I don't need a big amount of data, and I can actually extract that data back. Once the data come back to me. So people are actually building very, very low power, extremely low power, but of course low volume in terms of data. And so these sensors are actually not just wireless, self-organizing, but this is even a level better to actually use. These are of course ideas. These are maybe at the moment people are looking at. I'm not saying that these have become a norm in this, but the signal processing has gone leaps and bounds and bringing not just only applications in science or industry, but agriculture. And today we are talking about, unprecedented times. The importance of signal processing and sensors in medical has become even more. Of course, what I shown on your slide is the so-called PET imaging, which is you all know about it very well. But now people have taken that imaging technology to something else. Can I kind of take the sensor which requires let us say X-rays in this case, okay? That is a small sensor chip that I have. When a patient is exposed to X-ray imaging, can I actually get this image not on one, but 256 by 256 matrix, which is each one is about 50 microns. Can I take an image like a two-dimensional picture using parallelly processed on 50 by 50 matrix on 256 by 250 cells, have the entire electronics padded right, integrated right below the sensor chip itself. And then, as I said sometime back, I wire bond the entire signal onto a system. If I can run that kind of system, what I'm actually looking at is the sensor picking up the X-ray image here. And for each of those 256 by 256 pixels, I have standard electronics, all embedded inside, an amplifier, comparator. You remember I talked to you all this, a counter and so on and so forth. What do I get at the end? If I allow the patient to go through not just one X-ray film, but actually scan the patient with the different energies of an X-ray film, and if I can actually put that data together, instead of having a gray or black and white, an X-ray image, I can actually get to a molecular level of images for different elements in the body. I can actually, like a page of the book, I can ask you to kind of show me the layers and layers of the patient with a molecular level of precision. This will allow the radiologist or the physician to look at the patient's health years ahead before the patient problem will come up. And today, similar sensors have become common kind of a level where the same sensor developed by companies which are doing for science applications, they actually use these sensors and signal processing electronics for real-time PCR, antibody testing, X-ray imaging, CT imaging, digital pathology, you name anything. All those research applications are now coming up and helping people in the unprecedented times. Some of you must be already knowing how Apple or some Fitbit or Samsung picks up very simple techniques that we use in the signal processing and actually literally makes sensors which can be their wearable, and then not just oxygen level in the body, but actually measure a whole lot of stuff. Here, the sensor integration becomes very important because it is the same chip that you use for sensor, same chip, same material that you also use for electronics and so on, right? Okay. A lot of interfacing standards have become available for sensors, but I want to just highlight one of them, which is IEEE. Because this is an IEEE meeting, it becomes a very simple sensor communication standard that IEEE has provided. Those of you who work with sensors, this particular standard is the standard for specifically dealing with smart sensors. So I would like to kind of go a little fast because I think I'm running short of time. Yeah, this is what I was kind of talking about. Since material used for sensors and VLSI circuits, actuators, etc., are the same. So if you put them together, co-design them, it will actually help reduce the size of the finished product. It will consume low power, maybe much faster to kind of bring the system out. All those EMI, EMC, etc., can be avoided. Of course, it will give a better signal to noise, right? So therefore, now the technology integration of sensors and systems, sensors and the signal processing circuits are becoming much cheaper for high volume production, especially. Okay. Just a couple of words, a couple of slides on the way we are talking about. Since we talked about VLSI, I think it becomes important how we scale up. Of course, the father of all the scaling was none other than Gordon Moore, which I think we still follow his kind of predictions that happen. The chips getting cheaper, the chips getting made much bigger and much smaller in size and so on. All that is required because of the planar resistance property, which we learned in school. Depending on if I have materials which are of different lateral sizes, the thickness being same, and the resistivity being same, all are required to make smaller and bigger devices is basically, it's like taking a cursor, zooming out and zooming in. The property being same, it's only scales up equally. So I can make with the same material, same resistivity, same thickness, I'll be able to make smaller and smaller devices, which we call node sizes in some way, right? So you can really see starting from 1960s, we can see a continuously growing down system, which is actually called International Technology Roadmap, how the chips are going to become smaller and smaller. By the way, IEEE itself now has its own roadmap, which is called International Roadmap for Devices and Systems, which is put up, and you can really see sitting at around 2020s, we are actually talking about few nanometer size kind of structures which are becoming possible. And if you really look up and Google up, you'll find what is the race that the companies are going. If you talk about September 2020, let us say Intel talks about 10 nanometers. The super fine, I told you, fintech kind of architectures. And then just after a few months, in May 6th, IBM talks about 2 nanometer chip, making a multiple three-dimensional kind of a chip, which I'll show you. And hardly a couple of weeks later, TSMC talks about 1 nanometer technology, which is actually reaching in some way to the zero Schottky barrier, which means they have hit what is the theoretical kind of energy barrier for electronics to form a semiconductor kind of a chip. I mean, that is the kind of race that you see these days, right? And of course, there are lots of problems or technologies, challenges for technology scaling. That is something which you need to really, or the opportunities for younger people. So I would like to kind of skip some of these slides because they are something to do with how you actually measure the node sizes and so on. But what I really wanted to do is, now gone are the days where the chip is a two-dimensional wafer on which you grow transistors, but people are not talking about, can we actually make, instead of one tire, can I make multiple tires? Okay, how do you build? So I make one entire structure of, let us say, billions of transistors. I go ahead and make another layer, and of course I interconnect from one layer to another layer. But the problem that one talks about when you have semiconductor materials is that when I want to grow a second layer on the top, the temperatures that are kind of, required, maybe the silicon will not be able to allow this to kind of work. So people actually found that can we use non-silicon technology, for example, so-called CNT, carbon nano tubes transistors, which will allow at a lower temperatures, I can grow structures in parallel. So this is what is called monolithic 3D ICs. In one IC, I'm actually talking about 3-dimensional. It's not just 2-dimensional kind of a chip. These are kind of challenges that happens. But as I told you, when you talk about multiple layers, it becomes very important. How do you make interconnection? So this is what is called tungsten via. The via is similar to like what we do in printed circuit boards, but it's important that it has a certain layers of material, and the interconnection that happens between the conducting things happen between more and more. But soon people found that, look, this is not so good because there are hundreds of kilometers of tungsten that is required from one contact to another contact. And if I have those, like a wall of those wires, that itself is taking a lot of space. Then now came up with what is called a gap fill process, which reduced the total volume required for wires by almost 50%. This is what is happening as you and me speak here. The technologies are growing like unbelievable kind of a pace. For example, now people are talking about, I'm not talking, forget about, having a lid on the top of the IC, because now if there is a lid already made, the thermal management of the chip becomes important, right? I mean, difficult in some sense, right? So because lid itself can be a kind of opaque kind of surface. So can I take out the lid and supply the chip where there is no lid on the top? When the chip comes, I actually mount on the printed circuit board. Of course, these are BGA grade, but you see there is no lid on the top. I'll go ahead and make my own heat sink on the top, and maybe I'll use maybe heat pipe or maybe vapor channel or maybe even liquid flowing through that, and then that particular thing can also be kind of used, as a stiffener. But the more important thing is I can do fantastic thermal management if I have direct access to the chip inside and so-called lidless. Now people don't stop. They don't want to stop at that point of time. Okay, if it is only that much, can I actually take a chip like this, and when I'm manufacturing it, let me kind of make a very, very fine, tiny slits, okay, which are etched on the top of the, let us say, the chip itself. Okay, what is the advantage? The advantage, these are like small pipes, and once I buy a chip, I can actually connect my coolant system through those micro fluidic cooling channels, and then I'll be able to cool the chip much more effectively than the thermal design that I talked about previous. These are the kind of advances that are happening, because when you put so much power, literally, into a chip, the challenge also becomes, into thermal management. And when I make the chip very small, it also makes difficult the amount of coolant that I can use to cool the chip also becomes limited. So people have actually gone into that kind of technology. So since I kind of running short of my time, I would like to end by this slide. The sensors and signal processing are the most crucial components, and today for most of the electronic systems. In fact, IoT is just one of them, which actually owes its phenomenal growth to the versatile sensors and also VLSI-based signal acquisition systems. Now, in fact, some of the sensor development as well as the IC fabrication technologies that I talked about, it depends on some of the material science, microfabrication techniques, very, very low weight signal processing architectures. These are particularly important because if I want to have a wireless self-organizing kind of sensor networks, I can't have a very heavy duty signal processing circuit sitting there. It will consume a lot of power, right? And that is what is doing a big, applications these days. As I said, the IC industry has followed the study path all the way from Gordon Moore. The way I didn't spend time on how the actual metrics that kind of found, but you can imagine starting from hundreds of micron level. Today we are talking about 1 or 2 nanometer kind of a level, and these are concurrently, making very, very good progress. and not just in one area, but also finding fantastic applications. I talked to you a little bit about science applications because that's where I come from, but I also showed a few, at least a couple of applications in medicine and agriculture. So if you want to continue this particular growth, the semiconductor industry not just require advances in only one front, like electronics or front-end process or lithography, actual process which is used to etch transistors on the wafer, and designing very, very high performance processors. You saw the system on chip kind of thing. Power management, thermal management, this becomes a major issues. I think those are the challenges, but I would also say that there are also maybe opportunities for many of us. With that, I would like to thank all of you, and I would like to thank the organizers particularly for giving me this opportunity. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Dr. Satyanarayan sir, for such an insightful session. It was wonderful having you as a speaker for the event. We sincerely thank you for sharing your knowledge and experience with us.
Thank you.
And I would again like to request all the participants to fill out the feedback form for the event certification without fail. The link will be provided soon. And sir, now I would like to address few questions from the chat box, which are asked by the participants. Yes. So first question is, how can we convert signals from analog to digital?
Yeah, I did mention a couple of them, a few of them. Maybe I ran through because I exactly didn't know what should be the level at which I should go on. When you talk about what is the difference is you have one signal which is which if I can draw a profile of a signal, let us say time on the y-axis and the voltage or amplitude on the y-axis, right? And you can see the signal is so-called continuously changing with time. Whereas digital, you expect this to happen, switch between two logic state, whatever you call 0 or 1 or true or false or whatever it is. Now, the thing that we all know is if I have certain analog signal, the signal which is which I need to kind of convert into a number. Okay, people use standard technique called analog to digital converter. Now, what is that doing, right? I mean, if I can give you a very hand-waving kind of explanation. So if I give you, let us say, a voltage of 1.2 volts, and if I have a chip which will measure 5 volts chip, I will actually put, say, I'll try to kind of keep comparing. I will say it is 1.2. I have the full range of 5 volts. Okay, let me take 2.5 volts. Okay, are you above 2.5 or below 2.5? The answer comes, no, I'm below 2.5 because I'm 1.2, right? Then, fine. Okay, so the upper 2.5, I don't have to worry about. Now I'll say the 2.5, I'll divide into 2. So let us say 1.25. Then I'll ask a question again, are you above 1.25 or below 1.25? It will tell me, no, I'm still below 1.25 because it is 1.2. So I again cut off another, binary half, right? Next, I'll go to 1.25 by 2, maybe 0.675 or whatever. Now this guy will say, yes, I'm above you. So I'll keep this one, and now I'll start narrowing down. So again, I divide by 2, I narrow down. So what I'm doing here, I'm actually making successively approximating what is the input voltage that I've given. So that is what is called successive approximation method. That is one way to convert a voltage or an analog signal into a digital equivalent, because each comparison becomes a 1 or 0, as the case may be, and I move from left to right or right to left, depending on how many bits I can have. So if each of the bit is, let us say, 5 millivolts, and if I have some number which I got as 1000, and then it will become 1000 into 5 millivolts or 2 power whatever that number of bits that is. But that is very old and classical method. As I said, I don't do this comparison one at a time. I actually will have a bank of comparators and then ask a question. Is it more than 5? Is it more than 2.5? Is it more than 1.25? Is that more than 0.6? All those questions I ask together. The answers come instantly, and then I'll get like in a flash. That's why it's called flash ADCs. I mean, that is the way that you convert an analog voltage. So the word to remember is analog to digital converters. It converts a voltage or an amplitude into a series of zeros and ones or a number.
Okay, sir. The next question asked is where and how are the soft core processors used?
Sorry?
Where and how are the soft core processors used?
Okay, nice one. So what did we say software processor? Software processors are, let us say, a kind of structure that is sitting inside a programmable chip like, let us say, FPGA. Okay. Now, FPGA has a huge area of programmable hardware, which means I can change what circuit I want to build inside FPGA by programming those switches. Okay. Today I can make a washing machine controller. Maybe using one FPGA. Tomorrow I can take the same FPGA and build maybe a microwave oven or whatever you like. Right? There's no issue. Now the problem is, along with that programmable hardware, which is so much part of the FPGA, in one place I also have something similar to what you have a microcontroller. Let us say 8051. I don't know what those numbers are, so instead of building or interfacing this hardware, programmable hardware to another microcontroller, somebody has put that microcontroller also inside. Okay, I can actually take a core which is freely supplied by maybe some company. I can put that in the FPGA and I can program it exactly like using the way you use, how you program a microcontroller, right? Nowadays, you have those cross compilers and so on, and you take the code. So FPGA principle has two parts. One is the programmable hardware and a microprocessor itself inside, not one. If you like, you can put an entire Intel Xenon or somebody inside. There's no issue. You can put thousands of microcontrollers inside one chip. So those can be programmed like the way you program any microcontroller outside. If you don't like that, you can tell the company, I would like to have a PowerPC shipped to me along with the FPGA, or I would like an ARM Cortex to be shipped along with the PowerPC. They will supply to you. That is hardcore, hard IP. Whereas the other one, what you built is soft processors. So these are like something which you can program by software. The other one, the programmable hardware, you need to program using so-called HDLs. That is, hardware description languages like your VHDL, I told you HLS or Verilog and so on and so forth. The other one, soft core process, requires standard, what you can say, microcontroller nomenclature, mnemonics, and so on. Yes.
Yes, sir. So the next question is, what are the possible fabrication challenges when moving from nanometer technology to subatomic structures? Any hope of high-tech fab labs to be established in India soon?
Of course, this is a big question, and so one of the first part of the question to answer. Of course, you can't really go beyond what a material can offer. If I really need to build structures which are better than or close to an atomic level, it becomes what purity of this material that I can make the semiconductors with. And it is extremely, extremely difficult to go to purity levels which are amenable to develop the node cells or node structures, node sizes which are nanometer level. Ultimately, I mean, that 1 nanometer, etc., is an ultimate limit because you are actually reaching to an energy levels which are just enough to emit electrons or your main carriers in the case of any semiconductor devices. So you can't go below that. Now, I mean, if you want to go, still have the densities which will, you want to continue Moore's expectations way beyond. As I said, one of the techniques that people learned is, as I told you, making a multiple layers of 3D structures and so on and so forth. Of course, the whole paradigm of quantum computing is altogether a big field which is catching up because it uses a completely different, you can say, processes or the physics that is required to represent a 0 and 1. It is not so much of a deterministic 0 and 1. The way you talk about semiconductor devices and chips, that goes with a quantum mechanical representation which I think I will refrain from taking up now today, but this is definitely a reality. There are at least 3 or 4 different processes, technologies, which are enabling quantum computation, quantum electronics rather, is happening. And that will suddenly open up a lot more leverage into what maybe semiconductor physics and semiconductor electronics can offer, and which anyway you have this barrier. You can't really go to subatomic structures. So one is aware, one is trying to keep the limit of subatomic structures and try to make intelligent architecture, as I said somewhere, like 3D and so on. This is still one is able to kind of push more transistors per chip, right? The other thing is completely a new phenomenon, new physics that can happen. People are looking at. So these are 2 kind of level. And quickly coming to the scenario about the second question, unfortunately, we don't have a great high-tech fab that the question asked about. In India, some of it is historic, unfortunately. We do have a few foundries. One of them belong to Department of Space. It's actually earlier called Semiconductor Complex Limited in Chandigarh, which is now coping up and making devices which are higher and higher densities, but not like the way I told you about TSMC or Intel or IBM, etc. It's far away, but I'm sure they're also kind of heading forward. And similarly, there are also small foundries owned by other governmental organizations. There are lots of so-called fabless facilities in India. Every MNC, all these fabs do have their design houses, but we don't have the fabs because remember, they're extremely expensive to set up fabs and even more difficult to maintain them. So you only have handful of fabs around the world. A few of them, even in TSMC is one of the biggest one. I just saw 2 days back a news item about in Wall Street Journal saying TSMC has become the world's biggest chip producer of all companies, and people are worried. Putting so much of the entire business on one small area in one small country, one small company. I mean, is it something good or not? So, but it is very, very expensive to build apps. So it's in India, yes, we unfortunately don't have a class of fabs that we can be proud of.
Okay, sir. What are the expectations from ADC in the industrial area? Please reply in terms of power and speed.
Power and speed.
Speed.
Speed. Yeah. Okay. I mentioned to you, in case of industry, mainly you talk about data collection, which are data loggers, it is called in the industry. And, take a typical example like I have industry base in which I need to collect a lot of ambient ambient parameters, process parameters, safety parameters, control parameters, and so on and so forth. They're all distributed throughout the industry. Sometimes they can be like, maybe acres of industrial area. So what is required there is, since there are large number of devices, always my requirement would be to see if I can kind of make them low power. Now, low power, speed, and size sometimes become trade-offs between an integrated circuitry. But here I can trade with low speed, but maybe low power is more important because industrial application speed is not such a big, unlike, as I said, strategic applications, science applications, avionics or space or whatever, some of them are very important that you need. No, even communication applications like 5G, etc. You require upper speed. So important thing is to kind of have larger integrated devices, able to operate them at, let us say, low power, but speed is not a main criteria. But what is even more important is when I have sensors or ADC spread over the entire industry, I would like to have the interface simple as possible. So which means, for example, there are many standard industrial buses, interface buses, they call like CAN bus, for example, one such standard. So can I make these devices compatible so that I can kind of make so-called something like plug and play. But in this modern era, people don't get satisfied like that, and they will actually say, no, 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 I don't want to do any signal processing outside. I would like to go for next level of so-called smart processors, smart sensors, where I would like to have the sensing and signal processing inside the chip and push the data on a serial kind of standards. It could be SPI, it could be, as I said, CAN bus, it could be RS232C, it could be, whatever, such I2C, etc. There, I2C and all are like the smaller distance standards. So people are looking for those standards, and of course, they are met quite easily because of the advances in the semiconductor industry.
Okay, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Now, I would like to request Professor Yashodas Muthu, Vice Chair, EPAC, IEEE Bombay Section, to present the vote of thanks to our esteemed speaker. Please, sir.
Thank you, Vrishti. Good morning to all the dignitaries and the attendees present over here. It is my privilege to propose the vote of thanks. First and foremost, a deep sense of appreciation to our speaker, Dr. B. Satyanarayan Sir, Scientific Officer H, PIFR Mumbai, and the Chair of IEEE Bombay Section for taking out his time for this wonderful, knowledgeable session and gracing this event with his valuable presence. Thank you, sir. I would like to express my gratitude towards the Chair of IEEE Signal Processing Society Gujarat Section, Dr. Chirag Poonwala, for his unflinching support towards this event. I would like to express our sincere thanks to the organizing team, the collaborators of this event, IEEE Bombay Section, and IEEE SPS Silver Oak University Student Branch Chapter for working it out together in shaping this event very well. Also, thanks to the student volunteers of this event who have been working behind the scenes and has invested their time in making things possible. Last but not the least, thanks to all the attendees for being a part of this event. I'm sure you all must have gained an immense knowledge from such a high quality session. Now, on behalf of IEEE SPS Gujarat Section, IEEE Bombay Section, and IEEE Silver Oak University Student Branch SPS Chapter, as a token of appreciation, I request the Technical Activity Chairperson of IEEE SPS Gujarat Section, Dr. Arpan Desai, to kindly present the digital memento to our speaker, Dr. B. Satyanarayan.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Yesu.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day ahead. Stay healthy and stay safe.
Once again, thank you
I
very
would
much.
request.
Yeah, sorry. Please go ahead, Vishnu.
No, sorry. Continue, sir. Continue,
No,
sir.
no, I just want to once again thank my good friend Chirag and Arpan, and also thank you so much to you for organizing so well the entire event. And I really enjoyed interacting with you and all the participants. I hope it was of some use. So thank you very much. Yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you, sir. I would like to request all the participants to switch on your camera for a group photo.
That's good.
अर्पण जनरली माइक ऑफ वीडियो ऑफ रखता है तो हमें करवाना पड़ता है उसको.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Also,
sir.
I would like to
Thank you.
welcome Meeta Poonwala, ma'am, Vice Chair, SPS Chapter, Gujarat Section, and Professor Darji, Associate Professor, SVNIT, and Chair, VDIT 2021.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, ma'am. Nice to meet you all.
Hello, sir. On behalf of IEEE SPS Gujarat Chapter, IEEE SPS Silver Oak University Student Branch Chapter, and IEEE Bombay Section, we would like to express gratitude to our esteemed speaker, Dr. Satyanarayan Sir. It was our honor to have you for the session. We would like to thank all the participants and committee members for attending and making this session more memorable. Once again, thank you all for joining. Keep learning and keep growing. Thank you.
Thank you.
very
Jyoti.
much.
Yeah, thank
Thank
you
you.
all.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you,
Thank you,
everyone.
Professor Satyanarayan, and we will be in touch for future also.
Thank you. Thanks once again, Chirag. Thank
Okay.
you.
Bye.
Bye bye. Yeah.
Professor Darji, do you want to share anything with Professor Satyanarayana related to VDET? You are muted. You are muted.
Yeah, all the audience, I just wanted to share the information we did this time is being hosted at SCNIT Surat. And since all the participants of this workshop means expert talk belongs to VLSI community, so I encourage all of you to please, contribute your research article paper in that conference. It is very renowned, and 25th version is just now going on. So, and very good review process is there, and there are good expert speakers we will invite. So please attend it, and it is online mode, so there won't be any difficulty for traveling in such a pandemic situation. So you can take advantage of pandemic. And yeah, and I'm very much thankful for Professor B. Satyanarayan. I was hearing you; it was very inspiring talk. And
Oh, thanks. Thank you.
and this VDET conference is in collaboration with IIT Bombay is going on, and our program chair, one of the program chairs is Professor Virendra Singh sir. So
Okay,
yeah, so we'll take your help also in case we want to have
Sure.
some review process, or maybe in case some expert talk to be arranged.
Sure. My pleasure.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
sir. Thank
Thanks
you.
once again, all of you. Yeah. Thanks, man.
Okay. Okay. Bye.
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 Bye, Chirag.
Thank you. Thank you, Chirag, for introduction. Thank you.
Yeah, it's always my pleasure.
Okay, Chirag, I'll leave.
Yeah, sir. Please, please.
Okay.